Welcome to week 5, where we are talking about defining groups. And as usual, I'm a presenter for this week. Let's look at what groups actually mean. So, of course, this week we'll be looking at certain key concepts. First of all, how to define speech community. So we have regions, we have speakers, and we have norms, right? And how are we going to define a community of practice? So that's something very interesting that we should explore as well in terms of interactions. And we also be learning some social network features and configuration, social identity and group membership, and last but not least, how beliefs about groups of speakers actually shape how we use language. So speech community, right? So social linguistics, as we know by now, is a study of language use within a group of speakers. So it's not just one individual speaker. So when we talk about groups, it has to be at least 2 members. Okay. So grouping can be for many reasons. So social, religious, political, cultural, familial, vocational, or educational, you name it, right? So some groups are temporary, some groups are permanent, some groups can be large, some groups are much smaller, some groups you belong to, and some you don't even meet face to face, right? So some are quite tight and some are loose, right? And some have very complex identity and so on. So basically, a speech community refers to all the people who use a given language. So this definition is very general, so equivalent to the definition of language, in other words. Okay, moving on to the next slide, we're talking about shared norms, right? So we're talking about people from the same speech community. They tend to share the same common feelings about one another, about linguistic behavior in the community. So they tend to observe a certain linguistic norms, right? So the speech community is not actually defined by any agreement in terms of the use of language elements according to Labov in 1972. So it's more towards the norms, right? And the pattern of usage of language. While Morgan actually talks about any speech community to reflect to what people know when they interact with one another. So it assumes that people come together through discursive practices. They probably operate in the same way, having a shared sense of norms, local knowledge, beliefs, and values. Okay, and probably they adhere to that, and that's fundamental, understanding of identity and a representation of ideology. So Gumpers, however, uses a linguistic community instead of speech community, right? So because it can be monolingual or multilingual in a set of people. So the social interaction patterns, okay, is the one that determines. So may consist of small groups of bound together by face-to-face contact, or may cover larger regions, right? Depending on the level of abstraction that we wish to achieve. So most probably the relationship within the community is important in this context. Okay, so well, of course, we know that when you're together, then in the community you tend to have certain social cohesiveness, right? Well, externally you may be cut off from other communities in certain ways. So in other words, you may be part of community A but not part of community B, right? So, for example, some North Americans who associate themselves, right, as North American as compared to Australia, right? But in another context, maybe you say that you're a Canadian rather than a US citizen. So that's where you tend to compare and contrast, and the context actually determines, right, what level of speech community is relevant to you and which group you are in. So sometimes it's depending on the geographical area, and we know that very well. Of course, some countries where and some communities tend to speak more languages. So there are other criteria as well apart from language and region to define speech communities. But generally, some people relate to where you're from or geographical area. And then we also look at communities of practice. So communities of practice is also something that we should look at when we talk about speech communities, right? So what does it mean? It refers to a group of people coming together because they're engaging in something, right? Engaging in some common endeavor. It's the way they do things, different ways of talking, beliefs, value system, power relations. In other words, they come together to practice something. And that's a joint activity that they have. So that's when it's called community of practice. So the members are doing something that makes them a community, in other words. So it can be a group of workers in a factory, for example, an extended family, a special interest group, women's fitness class, or kind of friendship groups and so on. So it's closely knitted sometimes, and maybe you can do it face to face, you can do it online these days. So these community practices, it shape us, right? It provides us with a certain kind of identity. Yeah. So you often subscribe to something. You have a Facebook group where all of you are grouped together in the community of practice, for example. So that defines your social group. So you socialize together, and the social practices determine which community of practice you are in. So it's not just the language that you speak. So of course, there are sometimes conflicts, and some people say you're included, sometimes you're excluded. So the inclusion and exclusion criteria are important here. So now let's look at some of these, words, right? Utterances, they call it. Do you think they're acceptable? Do you think they're not acceptable? Or maybe they're acceptable, right? So there are 1 to 12 questions here. So please go through this, okay? When you rewatch this video, or you can pause this video over here, and then for me, for now, I'll move on to the next slide first, because we would like to see what is your response. Why do you respond in that way? Okay, do you associate with some of the users of this particular group of speakers? And what are your perceptions of the regional and social class differences here? So discuss these questions, okay? Do you share these norms and explain the similarities and differences in your judgment? Also based on this week's lesson, please, okay, respond to the forum questions that we have. Okay, so I wish you good luck. I would look at share with you the questions again. So please reflect on these questions and reflect on your own practices as well. Thank you very much. See you in the next lesson. Bye bye.